The Gouffre Berger, near Grenoble in France, is one of the most famous caves in the world. It was discovered in May 1953, some 70 years ago. The pioneering explorations by local French cavers made this the first cave in the world to go deeper than 1,000 meters. I'm going to attempt to summarize the most important milestones in the exploration of the cave, along with support given by British cavers, in particular the Craven Pothole Club. I'll be telling the story in two parts. First of all, 1953 to 2023, the discovery and exploration over a 70-year period. And then finally, tagged on at the end, the 1973 expedition, the Craven Pothole Club and Dr Tony Waltham's expedition. This impressive photo shows a massive limestone cliff at an altitude of over 1,000 meters above Grenoble. And it's here that the village of Angers is to be found, which is where the mayor controls access to the Gouffre Berger. By the way, I'm very grateful to Robbie Shone and Dr Tony Waltham for sharing their fantastic pictures of the caves. I wasn't able to take any underground pictures, so this video wouldn't be possible without their support. For the first part of the story, I've picked out some important events beginning with the discovery of the Gouffre Berger back in 1953 and running all the way through to the present day. So let's make a start with the discovery back in 1953. Cavers were naturally drawn towards the caves de Sassenage, where a large underground river flows out of the mountain. It was here in the 1940s that French cavers first started explorations. By 1950, they'd penetrated deep enough into the cave to reach a flooded section known as a sump or a siphon, and they began searching above, up on the Sorin Plateau, for where the rainwater was sinking underground. The road going up onto the Sorin Plateau offers some spectacular views, such as this recent photo looking onto the village of Autrans. From 1951 onwards, the local cavers began systematically searching the limestone pavements. They found several caves, but they all soon became too narrow or were blocked by boulders. However, on the 24th of May 1953, Joe Berger discovered a new cave which had great potential. The cavers went down an 8-meter shaft, followed by a 30-meter pitch onto a floor of ice. The cave was designated P3, but later, when they penetrated deeper underground, it was renamed in honor of the man who discovered it, the Gouffre Berger. In October 1953, the cavers created the Grenoble Speleologist Club within the French Alpine Club, known as the SGCAF. Joe Berger and his caving companions gradually went deeper and deeper into the cave. Soon after the entrance, they descended several vertical shafts. Here's a view of the cave, like a bird's eye view looking through the rock. The cave appeared to be closing down when suddenly they squeezed through a narrow passage and into a really massive passage. And this continued beyond a lake, which they named after one of the team members, Jean Cadeau, and a dinghy was required. Then further on, they came to a steeply descending section that was appropriately named the Great Rubble Heap. By now, the cavers were struggling to descend, explore, and get back to the entrance all in one day. The French cavers decided to establish a campsite underground. Camp 1 was about 470 meters, or 1,540 feet, below the entrance. I can only assume that the tents provided some privacy and psychological comfort. Camp 1 was in close proximity to water dripping from the ceiling high above into rock pools, and the water could be collected and then boiled up for drinking, cooking, and washing up. They named the nearby chamber, which had some massive stalagmites, after the 13 people who were there when they discovered it, the Hall of the 13. Over the years, hundreds of cavers from all over the world have come here to admire the beauty and grandeur of these stalagmites and gower pools. By 1954, the cavers had begun really deep exploration. Their assaults used siege tactics like on Mount Everest, with several caving teams advancing, surveying, and then retreating for the next team to take over. The cave was followed down a series of waterfall pitches for another 2 kilometres to where they established a second camp. They returned next year and found that from Camp 2, the cave became more technically challenging. And by 1955, the French cavers had reached the top of a powerful waterfall, which they named Hurricane Shaft. This was at a depth of 985 metres. They'd run out of equipment, but here we see someone shining an electric torch over the lip of the waterfall. If you look carefully, you can see he's wearing a life jacket in anticipation of some more deep water. The cavers were absolutely sure this shaft was deep enough for the cave to exceed the 1,000-metre depth record. They began planning for a major expedition in 1956. Fernand Petzl was chosen as their leader because of his considerable caving experience, technical ability, and sociable personality. Petzl also ran what was then a small factory in Grenoble, manufacturing ice axes and wire ladders, but few could have predicted this would eventually grow to become a world-class business. Surprisingly, the news media doubted that the Gouffre Berger was going to be over 1,000 metres deep. This was one reason why Petzl decided to invite some foreigners who could add weight to their arguments. Only 2 British cavers were invited, one of them being Robert Powell, who was a member of the Craven Pothole Club, and the other was Nick Pratchett of the Bradford Pothole Club. Bob was a real tiger and one of the last cavers before they started wearing wetsuits. On 12th of August 1956, a team of 3 cavers passed the previous limit of exploration by descending the hurricane pitch, about 44 metres deep, landing in a steep chamber, and they continued into a deep canal passage and turned round at a depth of about 1,100 metres. In this way, the Gouffre Berger became the first cave in the world to be explored deeper than 1,000 metres. And then 2 hours later, 11 cavers set off and succeeded in passing the pseudo-siphon, as it was known, before reaching the actual terminal sump. And Bob Powell was amongst the few to reach the bottom at a depth of 1,122 metres or 3,681 feet. Finally, the news media actually believed the caver's testimony, at least in France, as you can see from these publications. But I can't help wondering how the news was reported elsewhere. For example, did it make it into the Guinness Book of Records? Many years later, this plaque was installed at the entrance, which I've translated as follows: 24th of May, 1953, Joe Berger with the Grenoble cavers from the SGCAF discovered this chasm. 19th of August 1956, they reached the terminal siphon at 1,122 metres. It became the deepest in the world. In memory of Joe, 1931 to 2005. 3 years after the discovery, the cave had finally been bottomed. Earlier I said the cave was bottomed on the 12th of August, but the plaque, as you can see, actually states the 19th of August. The explanation is that the cavers had loads of tackle and camping gear to haul back to daylight, and it took them a week before they could be interviewed by the news media. In 1957, Jean Cadeau published a book which has since become regarded as one of the classics. It describes the heroic efforts which, despite having only primitive equipment and simple techniques, had nevertheless reached the bottom of the cave. George Marais was on the 1956 expedition making a documentary film, and by 1962 he was ready to publish it under the name Siphon -1122. This video can still be found on YouTube and features a music track which is haunting and quite disturbing. In a way, the music expresses the Gouffre Berger's often brutal character of cold waterfalls and strong winds, which can prevent escape to the surface, as well as causing hypothermia. As mentioned at the start, the Gouffre Berger's river was known to emerge from the mountain at the Kira de Cessenasia. Obviously, cavers were keen to follow the river right the way through or find a high-level route, so that they could come right through the mountain, which would be fantastic. And the missing link, the gap between the Gouffre Berger and the resurgence at the Kira de Cessenasia was only 750 metres. So there's plenty to go at. For the next few years, the Gouffre Berger and another French cave, the Gouffre de la Pierre Saint-Martin, or PSM for short, were in competition with one another for the title of the deepest natural cave system in the world. The PSM is a few hundred miles away at the western end of the Pyrenees and runs beneath the border with Spain. It was not until the 1960s that British cavers began having their own expeditions. In August 1962, Frank Salt led an expedition which included David Judson of the Craven Pothole Club. A team of 38 cavers from a variety of clubs surveyed the lower chambers, and Ken Pearce, who you can see here, investigated the final sump. He actually free dived part way into the clear water and found it was a spacious passage. He was keen to return with air bottles and try to get through into what he hoped would be dry passages beyond. In 1963, Ken Pearce joined a team from the Pegasus Club in Nottingham, led by Steve Wynne Roberts, who was also Ken's support diver. They spent 10 days underground. Ken could tell that some of his team members were unhappy, but he didn't want them escaping to the entrance since they were needed for carrying equipment around underground. He is reputed to have used some interesting man management techniques, such as banning team members from taking a wristwatch and ordering Aldo's shaft to be de-laddered to keep everyone underground. On this, Ken's second visit to the Gouffre Berger, he dived into the sump with the aid of a small air bottle known as a tadpole. Cave divers have an unbreakable rule to stop exploration after using a third of their air supply. They are meant to turn around, and if all goes well, they will use the next third of air getting back to base. The final third of air is kept in reserve for an emergency, such as losing the guide rope or getting things tangled up in it. Well, Ken dived into the sump and swam for 70 metres when suddenly he surfaced in a large passage. His depth gauge had recorded minus 11 metres. On the far side of the sump, there was an airspace, but after another 40 metres, he was stopped by another sump. Meanwhile, the French authorities realised the expedition didn't have a proper insurance certificate. The rest of the team didn't know this. But after 13 days underground, Ken returned to the surface and was immediately arrested by the local police. He was only allowed to go on his way after paying a substantial fine. Ken returned the following year, 1964, but flooding prevented them from reaching the bottom. Then in 1966, the Gouffre de la Pierre Saint-Martin was linked to the higher entrance of the Tete Sauvage, giving a total depth of 1,171 metres, which meant that they had taken back the title of the world's deepest cave. In 1967, Ken Pearce returned for a fourth time, leading a team from the Pegasus Club and the British Speleological Association with the Happy Wanderers Craven Pothole Club. Apparently, His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh agreed to be the patron, which must have helped a lot with fundraising and sponsorship. This was going to be a massive assault. To quote from the expedition report, the advance party, totaling 17 men, left for France in the early afternoon. On arrival at Calais, the lorry was impounded by French customs officials who couldn't understand how 3 men were going to eat 2 tons of food in 4 weeks. On the 18th of August 1967, Ken Pearce dived again through the first sump, surfaced and then negotiated 18 metres of low air passage before diving into the second sump. After only 40 metres, he surfaced again, this time in a good-sized passage, until having to stop at the top of a pitch, which he estimated to be about 30 metres below the level of the first sump. In this way, the 1967 expedition had pushed the cave to a new world depth record of 1,129 metres, or 3,704 feet. My friend Glyn Edwards once told me about an inscription on the wall which read simply, "Happiness is compulsory." Ken Pearce had achieved a lot on his expeditions, but he may well have lost some friends along the way. Here's a picture of the 11 cavers who reached the sump, and Ken is highlighted at the back next to the tent. Ken was also supported by Dave Gill in the red circle, who went on to become one of Britain's most experienced cavers. In 1968, a French team camped below hurricane pitch, which enabled Bernard Ledger and Jérôme Dubois to go beyond Ken Pearce's limit. They discovered over 600 metres of new passage, which ended in another sump at a depth of 1,133 metres, or 3,717 feet. The 1970s saw the start of a more lightweight approach to visiting the Gouffre Berger. It was around this period that most cavers switched from exploration mode into a more recreational way by having sporting trips. In 1971, the University of Leeds Speleological Association, known as ULSA, combined with the Happy Wanderers Craven Pothole Club by making an assault on the cave. Dave Brooke is credited with having taken these pictures. I particularly like the house-sized boulder on the great rubble heap. In 1971, these two clubs had some of the best cavers in Britain. They all seemed to enjoy a charmed life, discovering new caves and extensions throughout the Yorkshire Dales and beyond. But unfortunately, their expedition experienced several unforeseen setbacks, including high water levels. 4 of them got to the top of the Little Monkey Pitch above hurricane, but then reluctantly had to turn around. That same year, 1971, under the leadership of Dr Tony Waltham, 5 British cavers who were new to the cave were able to rig and de-rig on ladders as far as Camp 2 in only 4 days, which was very impressive. By the early 1970s, quite a lot of British cavers had visited the Gouffre Berger. And in 1972, the Kendal Caving Club set a new speed record. Jeff Yeadon and Oliver Statham, who you can see here, became famous for epic cave diving achievements in the Yorkshire Dales. But they also did something quite amazing at the Gouffre Berger. The cave had been rigged for abseiling and prussicking, and they became the first cavers to reach the bottom and out again in a continuous trip. Not just within 24 hours, but in only 10 hours. In fact, they reached the terminal sump in only 3.5 hours. However, their achievement was marred slightly by what Dave Watson described as disreputable goings-on at base camp, including the ascent of the Mayor's flagpole and an accident with a Land Rover. Incidentally, the Kendal Caving Club returned in 2003, so their relationship with the French had clearly recovered. The following year, in 1973, the Craven Pothole Club, in collaboration with Dr Tony Waltham, had a high-speed trip to the bottom of the cave and back again using a running ladder technique that we'll deal with right at the end of this video in part 2. And then in 1975, there was a terrible accident due to flooding, and it claimed the lives of 2 cavers. It so happened that John Worley, Dave Alanak, who you can see here, and myself had gone on a caving holiday in Sardinia with Loughborough University, otherwise known as LUST. And on the way back home, we decided to camp at La Molière, just for old time's sake. The weather was fantastic, and the views across the plateau and the hills beyond were quite stunning. This animal trough was the only convenient source of water. Dave and I walked over to the Gouffre Berger, but we were shocked to learn there'd been a double fatality and the bodies were still underground. Later, we heard that the retrieval of the bodies had taken the French authorities nearly 3 weeks. In time, a plaque was installed, and this is what the translation says: "Forever linked to the history of the great abyss from which they returned, united by the same passion, united by the same action. Eric Minier, 3/12/58, to 8975, and Alain Marchal 8658 to 8975. Here's a bolt that was installed by myself on the Craven Pothole Club's expedition in 1973. We put this in at the top of the hurricane pitch, and then I discovered sometime later that two cavers from Lancashire, Peter McMullen and Peter Wilson, had been caught by the same floodwaters which had claimed those two lives. Fortunately, they'd been able to securely clip themselves onto this big bolt at the top of Hurricane Shaft, and they spent 10 hours there until the water levels fell and they were able to get back to the surface. So in 1982, Patrick Penez dived downstream in sump 5 of the Berger for 170 metres and reached a depth of 50 metres, pushing the depth of the cave to 1,191 metres, or 3,907 feet. In 1987, Alex Pitcher, a British caver, somehow got lost near the entrance series, and despite an extensive search, his body was not found until a full year later in the meanders near the entrance. Very sad. In 1990, Frederick Pugier made a 205-metre dive, which linked up with the nearby Scaletta La Fromagerie. This provided the sixth entrance into the system and increased the vertical range to 1,271 metres, or 4,170 feet. In 1994, the Craven Pothole Club had a meet there led by Dave Hogarth. 70 people were in camp, and half of them reached the bottom of the system, which is quite amazing. Steve Warren became the oldest Englishman to reach the sump, and Martin Holloway and Fritz reached the bottom and out in only 9 hours. So that was an hour faster than Jeff Yeadon and Oliver Statham. So again, quite an achievement. On the 6th of July 1996, Nicola Perrin, previously Dollymore, of Oxford University Caving Club, and a Hungarian, Istvan Torada, died when they were struck by violent floods deep inside the cave. 4 other experienced cavers did survive, although exhausted and needing to be rescued. I understand that as a tribute to Nicola, a new telephone system was devised which would enable good communications further down inside deep caves such as the Gouffre Berger. In the year 2000, the Craven Pothole Club had another meet, and this was led by Alan Davey. And this time there were 50 people in camp, and many of them reached the Hall of the 13. The problem was that the meet was spoiled really by thunderstorms, so the trip to the bottom was reluctantly but wisely abandoned. Next we come to Robbie Shone, the famous cave photographer whose work we've already been admiring. And this is what he said about the Gouffre Berger, that it remains a true classic. In the same way that a mountaineer would want to climb Mount Everest, the Gouffre Berger is one of those caves you've just got to do in your lifetime to do a complete set of caves. I think in this picture you can see Robbie wearing the red helmet in the middle of the group. And just for interest, the second man from the left is Bob Toogood, a well-known Derbyshire caver. Robbie and his team visited the Gouffre Berger 7 times between 2010 and 2013 in order to produce the sort of pictures that we're going to see in the next few minutes. I think you're going to enjoy them. So I'm just going to let the music play now in the sequence of going down all the way to the bottom of the cave. Well, I'm sure it took a lot of effort by Robbie and his friends to produce those photos, which are certainly world class. The technicalities of taking pictures deep underground like that are certainly beyond me, and very few cavers are up to it. Rob and his friend Mark went on to invest hundreds more hours in researching and writing the only comprehensive and fully illustrated book about the exploration and wonders of the Gouffre Berger. And their book was published in 2014 by Vertebrate Publishing in Sheffield. It still sells for £40, but it's well worth it. The book is written in English and in French. It's available online by ordering direct from Starless River and some other sources as well. In 2011, there was an attempt on the terminal sump. It was dived by Damien Vigneault, Emile Tarizen, and David Bazzani, but sadly without much progress. Incidentally, the next year, the French cavers produced a film called Immersion, which is still available to view on Petzl's YouTube channel. During the period 2014 to 16, a new cave entrance was discovered, and this was the 11th so far and explored. It was known as the Delta 36 Chasm. In 2019, the Craven Pothole Club returned for a meet led by Glenn Costin, 18 members and a dozen from other clubs. 20 reached the bottom of the cave and out again safely, and Glenn's video is available on YouTube. And now we come to the second part of this video, which is about the 1973 expedition by the Craven Pothole Club in collaboration with Dr Tony Waltham. British cavers have recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of the discovery and exploration of Gouffre Berger, a deep cave in Iran. The expedition was led by David Judson, with Tony Waltham as his deputy. Almost half the caving team on the Iran expedition were members of the Craven Pothole Club, as highlighted here in green. The club's cottage and headquarters is located in the heart of the Yorkshire Dales, at Horton in Ribblesdale. Over 2,500 caves and potholes have been discovered and explored and mostly surveyed in this part of Yorkshire. Following the Iran expedition, some of us began planning a trip to the Gouffre Berger. We had in mind to be away in France from the 11th to the 26th of August. In December 1972, Tony asked Fernand Petzl, who was one of the original explorers of the cave in the early 50s, if the CPC could have a permit. A few weeks later, Tony heard back that the French have it booked all summer. Therefore, on the 27th of January, I wrote a letter to Fernand Petzl asking if the Craven Pothole Club could tag along with one of the French caving clubs. Petzl replied on the 5th of March, saying the 4 French clubs would have left the Berger by the 15th of August. So, on the 30th of March, I wrote to the mayor of Enghien, which was the nearest village, asking for a permit for 6 experienced cavers from the 15th of August, just for a week. On the 21st of April, the mayor replied, which you can see here, politely explaining that French cavers had got the Berger booked for the entire summer period. We were back to where we'd started, which was disappointing. However, our friend Dr Tony Waltham, who I'd mentioned earlier, and seen here in the blue highlight, happened to mention that Fernand Petzl had granted him a permit for the week of the 20th to the 26th of August. This was so that Tony could take his Canadian friends on a photographic trip as far as the Hall of the 13. Tony wanted to be helpful, so he again contacted Petzl and the mayor. Thankfully, they agreed that Tony's permit could include the Craven Pothole Club. We would be piggybacking onto Tony's trip. The deal was that Tony would install Imperial College ladders and lifelines as far as Camp 1. We could use Tony's tackle, stay at Camp 1, about 1,500 feet underground, and then try for the bottom of the cave. On returning, we would de-tackle the entrance pitches. Finally, we would transport all Tony's ladders and lifelines back to his home in Nottingham. At this stage, there was only John Allenby, Clive Green, Pete Gray and myself committed to the expedition. Pete Gray had missed out on the Iran expedition, but he had loads of experience of original exploration in the Yorkshire Dales and Ireland. A few others had expressed interest, and their initials can be seen here. Roy Blackham was keen to join the party, but later dropped out because of not being able to get time off work. Dave Alnack wanted to go, but later had to withdraw. Pete Standing had been on the Iran expedition and was going to be our medical officer, but unfortunately he too had to drop out. Glyn Edwards of the Yorkshire Ramblers Club expressed an interest, and he had already been to the bottom of the Berger, but sadly he too had to pull out in the end. By this stage it was the end of June, and we were only 6 weeks from departure, so we had to quickly cast around more widely. First to sign up was Adrian Bridge, who was a good caver and a rock climber. He was very sociable and had a can-do attitude which everyone appreciated. His organisational skills helped to get the expedition back on track again. However, he had one condition, and that was that to be a viable team, it needed to recruit one more caver. At that point, I nominated Judith Martineau. She was in her late teens, a good friend of mine, and a keen caver. Back then, the Craven Pothole Club did not allow female members. Nevertheless, Judith agreed to join the expedition on the understanding she would wait behind at Camp 1 while the rest of us attempted to reach the bottom of the cave. It so happened that Judith's father was the rector of Skipton Parish Church, which was handy as I was increasingly feeling we were going to be needing some divine intervention. With only 6 cavers, there was no way we could use siege tactics of some of the previous expeditions. We simply could not carry all that equipment, tents and stoves and all the rest of it. Instead, we would have to adopt the caving equivalent of an alpine ascent by travelling fast and with the absolute minimum of equipment. Now let's have a brief excursion into how cavers back then used to get up and down vertical drops or pitches. As previously mentioned, Tony had agreed to provide and rig ladders and lifelines as far as Camp 1. This photo shows the traditional way of rigging a pitch with an anchor for the person holding the lifeline and a separate anchor for the ladder. In this example, the anchor on the left is a steel piton and the other is a rock spike. Here you can see a traditional wire ladder with the aluminium rungs coiled up for ease of carrying. Note the nylon rope, which is chain linked to avoid snagging on projections when passing through the cave passage. From Camp 1 onwards, we would be using our own equipment. We considered the relatively new technique of abseiling and prussicking underground on single ropes, but instead we devised a new method whereby a rope would run through a pulley at the top of each pitch, and we could use the same ladders over and over again on the way down, and then haul them back up and use them again on the way out. For this, we needed some extra gear, including a figure-of-8 descender, which is highlighted with the red circle, a Jumar clamp, or alternatively, a clog ascender. At each pitch, the cavers would abseil to the bottom. To the right, you can see how an extra anchor point is being used for additional safety. Finally, the last caver would either abseil down on a double rope or else climb down the ladder whilst attached to a figure-of-8 descender, just in case. Next, the ladder would be lowered down and a knot tied in the rope to ensure it would remain in place for the return trip a few hours later. The beauty of this technique was that the same ladders could be used over and over again. However, this all depended on the ladders running freely and not getting snagged on anything. If they did get snagged, we would be able to continue downwards and may not get out again either, which would be embarrassing and potentially dangerous in a cave so deep and prone to flooding. Another problem was that the ladder could not be attached to an anchor point partway down the pitch. Therefore, we would often be climbing under a waterfall, which was bad enough, but would become impossible if the cave began to flood. On the return journey, ladders would be clipped onto one side of the double rope and hauled up the pitch as far as the pulley. The rope would then be secured at the bottom so that the first caver could climb up using a Jumar clamp or a clogger in case he slipped or something. Much would depend on having a secure anchor. The first man up would then clip onto the anchor and take in the lifeline as the next person climbed up the ladder until everyone was safely back at the top. Now, all these years later, with the benefit of hindsight, this running ladder technique seems quite reckless, and I would advise against anyone trying it, especially in such a deep and serious cave system as the Gouffre Berger. Tony recommended we consult a list in the Yulsa Review number 10, which gave the depth of each pitch. These figures were fresh from their 1971 expedition, as previously mentioned. I must have started scribbling these down literally on the back of an envelope. From the entrance to Camp 1, some 1,500 feet underground, we would need 850 feet of tackle, which Tony would be providing. The next section, from Camp 1 to Camp 2, at about 2,800 feet underground, would need another 300 feet of rope, but double that because of our running ladder technique. Then, from Camp 2 to the bottom of the cave, we would need another 500 feet of rope, but again, twice as much because of installing a double rope on each pitch. As you can see, our calculations were a bit iffy, but somehow we came up with a figure of 2,000 feet of rope required. Our expedition was around the same time as the club meet at Gaping Gill, so there wasn't enough rope available. We'd heard that Dr. Pete Standing, who'd been on the Iran expedition, might have a 500-foot drum of polypropylene multi-filament rope, and sure enough, Pete obliged. Polypropylene rope was lightweight and easily floated, but had the disadvantage of having a very low melting point, and might even melt if we tried to abseil down it, let alone if we came into contact with the naked flame of a carbide lamp. We were going to have to be very careful. Next, we had to decide how many ladders to take. Hurricane shaft was the deepest at about 160 feet. Each wire ladder was 25 feet long, therefore we'd need 8 ladders, and we ended up adding 2 more just for safety. By reusing these same ladders, we should be able to get down and out again, at least in theory. Oh yes, almost as an afterthought, Adrian pointed out that we needed insurance in case of rescue. He found out that Barclays Bank offered an insurance policy for only £3 each for a week underground. This seemed to be too good to be true. Still, we each paid up, whilst quietly hoping we'd never need to make a claim. So on Saturday the 18th of August, only 6 weeks after relaunching the expedition, and just a week after returning from Yugoslavia, finally, John Allenby, Clive Green and myself set off again for Dover and the car ferry. This time we were joined by Adrian Bridge, Pete Gray and Judith Martineau. We travelled across France in 2 cars, aiming to meet on Sunday afternoon at the campsite overlooking Grenoble. This was long before the Channel Tunnel, so we caught the car ferry across to Calais, then drove down the French motorway and around Paris. The weather was favourable and we broke the long journey at a campsite. As we got closer to Grenoble, the limestone rock formations became more impressive. Tony had sketched a map of the route up a winding road to reach the campsite at La Molière, near Angers. He also recommended Michelin map number 77. The scenery was spectacular as the mountain road climbed steeply around a series of hairpin bends leading to the famous Angers Gorge. Then at the last pub, we turned off to the right and followed a forest track for 8 miles. By now it was Sunday the 19th of August, and occasionally some breathtaking panorama would spread out between the lofty pine trees, their scent heavy in the warm summer air. Grenoble certainly was a much bigger city than we had expected. The red triangle you can see in the top left corner represents the campsite, and the strange shape nearby is the entrance to the Gouffre Berger 3 or 4 kilometres away. The campsite at La Molière was guarded by a line of fence posts to keep tourists from overrunning the idyllic pasture land. We made a brief detour and were soon bouncing along the Sorin Plateau. We set up camp alongside Tony Waltham and his 9 friends from Nottingham and Waterloo, Ontario. The next day, they tackled the cave as far as Camp 1, taking photos along the way. Underground photography is a highly skilled art form, and as I mentioned earlier, Tony has kindly allowed me to use some of his photos in this video. Robbie Shone has also given permission to reproduce some of his superb photos, taken about 15 years ago. On Monday the 20th, Peter and Adrian were given the day off to recover from their drive all the way from Yorkshire. So they went off to Grenoble to get some groceries. Meanwhile, the four of us set off carrying loads of equipment. The route to the cave entrance was mostly downhill and was marked by red paint splattered over the white limestone rocks. From the campsite to the entrance, as I said, was 3 or 4 kilometres. Here's a photo of the entrance, which, as you can see, has steep walls on 3 sides, but one side has a boulder-strewn gully, which we scrambled down with the aid of a hand line. Here's John Allenby getting changed into a PVC boiler suit and nearly ready to get started. At the bottom of the gully, we shoved our rucksacks through a tiny steel door, which led straight onto the first vertical drop of over 25 metres. The entrance pitch, known as Ruiz, was straddled by a dodgy wooden platform, as can be seen in Robbie Schoen's photo taken in about 2012. My friends in the Craven Pothole Club reported that this precarious platform was still there in 2019. Can't help wondering if it was installed during the original exploration 70 years ago and how much longer before it rots away. At the bottom, there was a patch of ice left over from winter. The red circle shows the entrance in a series. The red circle shows the entrance in a series of vertical shafts or pitches, many of them named after the original explorers in 1953. Ruiz, Garbies. It wasn't all straight down. This photo shows the meanders consisting of a long, narrow rift where explorers had to step on planks and stemples. As can be seen in Robbie Schoen's photo taken in about 2012, we were confident enough not to bother rigging safety ropes. We left our rucksacks at the bottom of Garbies shaft and reached the surface again after a trip of only 4 hours. Then it was back to the campsite for a good night's sleep. Tuesday was hot and sunny when we set off for the entrance again. This time our rucksacks were even heavier, having sleeping bags and carrying food for the next 4 meals that we anticipated for Camp 1. Here's a sideways view of the cave showing how at first it descends rapidly and then more gradually. Back at the bottom of Garbies shaft, we picked up the rucksacks, and I was relieved to have John and Pete on the team, who were by far the strongest and able to carry more than their fair share of tackle. Cairn Hall was a foretaste of what was to come in terms of the size and magnitude of the passage. Our initial holiday atmosphere began to evaporate as we went deeper and deeper. We eventually reached the imposing Aldo's shaft, and each abseiled down the freely hanging rope whilst making joyful shouts that echoed around the sombre blackness. At the bottom we were expecting a large passage, but were disappointed to find just a narrow fissure. Soon we were sliding through a gap under a boulder that emerged in a gallery of such huge dimensions that some of us set off walking in completely the wrong direction. Lake Caddo, which sometimes requires a dinghy, had fortunately dried up completely. It was quite muddy though. We caught up with one another at Little General Pitch and admired the splendour of the passage now illuminated by our combined head torches. We continued down to an immense passage known as the Great Rubble Heap. It was like being caught out at midnight on the slopes of Great Gable, a mountain in the Lake District. A precarious pathway led down the tottering scree slope. At the bottom we found some poly sheets which marked the location of Camp 1. We'd made it here in only 4 hours and were glad to dump sleeping bags, food and cooking gear. I remember Pete rummaging in a rubbish tip until he found an unopened tin of food. He could easily have suffered food poisoning, but thankfully he was all right. We enjoyed a quick meal, then set off carrying the equipment that would be needed for the next day. Soon we were entering the much anticipated Hall of the 13. This wonderful photo was taken some years later by the late Paul Deakin. Of course, at the time, all our headlamps could do was to project a small, tiny beam of light onto the ground. Here's another photo taken from exactly the same position, but the colour is more brown than I'd expected. It probably depends on what kind of flash bulbs are being used. This wonderful photo was taken by the late Jerry Wooldridge and shows cavers tiptoeing across a field of huge Gower dams set amongst towering pinnacles in the Hall of the 13. The colour somehow looks more authentic. Surely this must be one of the most beautiful passages ever discovered. Tony Waltham's photo clearly shows the way the flowstone forms a series of cascades. I expect drips from the ceiling way above would have gradually filled each rock pool. They were pure and clean. You could sometimes see tiny pebbles resting at the bottom. From Camp 1 and the Hall of the 13, we continued by following a seemingly endless cascade of Gower pool and flowstone, sometimes nearly 100 metres across, leading steeply down to the balcony pitch. From this point onwards, we would be rigging the cave with our own equipment using the running ladder technique that I've already described. This is the top of balcony pitch, where a powerful waterfall could be heard below. We dropped a ladder down. It was a pleasant 40-foot descent. And at the bottom, we found that the powerful waterfall was nothing more than an acoustic phenomenon. A hollow stalactite, like an elephant's trunk, was pouring out a spout of water into a natural rock pool. From here, the original explorers in the 1950s had used an inflatable dinghy to get across some deep canal passages, but we, with wetsuits, simply swam across, enjoying the buoyancy of the neoprene. The next section was a grand version of a Yorkshire cave with short wet pitches and pools. There was some scrambling upwards and other sections of walking amongst a profusion of stalactites. We turned a corner and reached Claudine's Cascade, where the stream was shooting out into the blackness of space. This impressive waterfall is nicely shown in another one of Robbie's photos, where someone in a yellow boiler suit is traversing out to avoid the full force of the waterfall. This is what we would be doing the next day. We found a ledge where ladders and ropes could be safely stored. Then we rushed back up the cave to Camp 1. Back in Camp 1, at the bottom of the great rubble heap, we gathered some water from the nearby Gower pools, boiled it up, and had another meal. Adrian and I had brought our own hammocks, one of which was tentatively attached to a long nail that had been hammered into a crack in the overhanging rock wall. Our 4 companions tried to sleep on the hard, mud-covered floor. By next morning, after breakfast, the 5 of us said farewell to Judith. We were feeling excited and apprehensive both at the same time, whilst trying to stay calm. Back at Claudine's Cascade, we each in turn stepped cautiously onto the long scaffold pole, which gave us a relatively dry descent of the ladder. The cave passages became even bigger until the Granyon was too much for our headlamps to illuminate. We descended a sometimes steep and muddy pathway to Camp 2. This had been used by the original explorers despite being cold and damp because of being located between 2 waterfalls. We regained the streamway below Goucher's shaft. A succession of small pitches in the full force of the waterfalls led to the head of the famous Grand Cascade. This was a really exciting place. At first, the ladder was in the full force of the waterfall, but in 4 crucial places, we were able to pendulum across and re-belay the ladder at ring bolts in order to get a dry hang. Unfortunately, the last man down had to unclip these points so we could pull down the ladders and use them again further down the cave. Also, this meant that on the way back up, we'd all be in the full force of the water. And if the cave started flooding, there's no way we could get back up. After only 4.5 hours, we reached the top of the infamous Little Monkey Pitch, as shown in Robbie's photo. To quote Adrian Bridge, this proved to be a difficult pitch to rig, necessitating a 5-metre traverse high on the right across an overhanging wall to a projecting knob of rock just big enough for 1 person to sit on. I was relieved when Pete Gray offered to lead the way, and when he was securely anchored, we took it in turns to join him briefly before making a free hanging abseil alongside the spray from the waterfall. The ladder dropped us straight onto a ledge at the top of the awesome Hurricane shaft. Around this time, with a different group of cavers, my friend Glyn Edwards had commented, "In the Oxbow, a calcited drop leads to a ledge at the top of Hurricane. This shaft seems much deeper than 180 feet. It was like abseiling Malham Cove in a thunderstorm." We peered over the edge, just as the original explorers had done all those years ago, into black space, where the noisy stream at one side caused cold winds to blow round about. Our remaining tackle was stored for a while in a low bedding plane at the side of the waterfall, and John Allenby was first to descend. After an apparently random series of whistle signals, the rope went slack and we pulled it back up. John had managed to scramble down the last 15 feet into an immense chamber. Pete and Clive followed. Adrian and I stayed behind for the time being. The hurricane pitch was dangerous after heavy rainfall, and several cavers had died here from exhaustion and hypothermia. All the way I'd been carrying a heavy ammo box containing some equipment for drilling bolt holes, which would secure the ropes and ladders. A metal peg or a piton wouldn't be as secure as a self-drilling bolt. Back then, British cavers were installing 3/8 of an inch redheads, named after the wedge. In view of the spray from the waterfall, I opted for a 3/4 inch diameter redhead bolt, which would take much longer to rust and become loose. Adrian helped me to hammer, twist and turn the drill. When the hole was just over 4 inches deep, I put in the wedge at the bottom and hammered it as hard as possible. Next, we attached an L-shaped steel anchor that was stamped with the Craven Pothole Club's initials. By the way, this picture was taken in 2019, some 46 years later, and the bolt still looks safe to use. Last of all, we clipped a carabiner or snap link into the anchor and rebelayed the alloy and wire ladder. By now, John, Pete and Clive had been to the sump and had rejoined us. I was feeling cold and vulnerable, but at times like this, Pete would often burst into song, which was great for morale. Adrian was next down the hurricane shaft, and then I followed. The bottom of the ladder was an inhospitable place, with strong winds and loud noise from the crashing waterfall. Our enthusiasm swept us along a fine river passage. While swimming across ice-cold canal passages, we could see through the clear blue water to where colourful pebbles were gleaming below. At last, the roof dipped gracefully into the sump pool. I did not feel at all victorious at this point, but really quite relieved and privileged, also vulnerable. The bitter cold was striking through our tattered wetsuits. It was reassuring to have a strong team at the top of Hurricane taking in the lifeline as we climbed back up that alloy and wire ladder. By now we were all feeling cold and tired. We still had several hours ahead of us to get back to Camp 1. If something went wrong and we failed to get there, Judith would be trapped without any prospect of returning to the surface and very little food left. I imagined she was praying, who wouldn't? And the words of a psalm came to mind, especially the line affirming, "In God's hands are the depths of the earth." And I wondered, or rather I hoped, that the creator of this amazing cave would enable us to get back to Camp 1 safely. However, on the way back up the cave, I did have a near-miss incident. It happened at the Grand Cascade. The other four had gone up when I slipped headlong into the deep, swirling pool. My carbide lamp was immediately extinguished, and back then we rarely carried a spare electric torch, which was odd really, but that was the norm. It took me a while swimming around the pool to find the end of the rope, just by touch. Fortunately, I was familiar with tying on a bowline around my waist in the darkness, but it was still a lonely and scary experience. So, on the Thursday evening, 19 hours after setting off, we'd reached the bottom and arrived back in Camp 1. Judith had made us all a marvellous pan of hot stew. And although it was Thursday, our internal body clocks were out of sync with real time on the surface. We snatched a few hours sleep. Then at 8:45 at night, We broke camp and began making our way back to the entrance. The passages were just as impressive as before, and from now on, caving in the Yorkshire Dales would always seem a bit of an anticlimax. We chose to move slowly and deliberately, partly because we were overloaded with equipment to carry. It was hard graft hauling equipment back up the vertical pitches, and the more of Tony's gear we detackled obviously meant there was more for us to carry. Finally, we surfaced around 8:45 on the Friday morning. It had taken the 6 of us 13 hours to go from Camp 1 back to the entrance. We emerged into dazzling sunlight. After spending 69 hours underground, the sunshine was physically painful. All I could do was simply lie down on the ground until my eyes had adapted, which took maybe 20 minutes. Later that same day, we accepted Fernand Petzl's kind invitation to visit his factory in St Izmir, near Grenoble. Adrian Bridge has described what happened. In stumbling French, we explained who we were, that we'd been to the bottom of the Berger, and we thanked him for his cooperation in arranging permission. Arthur presented him with a duplicate of the big bolt and bracket which we had fixed at the top of Hurricane shaft. Mr. Petzl seemed amazed and produced a bolt hanger of his own. He proceeded to weigh the bolt and the hanger and pronounced that ours was 21 times heavier than his. Back then, Petzl's factory was little more than a big garage and had few signs that it was ever going to grow into an organisation that would dominate the world of vertical access gear. On Saturday the 25th, we crammed all Tony's ladders and lifelines into our 2 small cars, then made our way back across France. On reflection, Tony's photo trip enabled us to reach Camp 1 quite easily, but after that we had been out on a limb, and the trip to the bottom and back could so easily have ended in disaster. A few months later, the editor of the Craven Pothole Club journal asked Adrian to write an article. Pete Gray also wrote an account in the cottage logbook at Horton in Ribblesdale, and I too wrote an article for Loughborough University speleological team. So now, some 70 years after discovering the entrance, the Gouffre Berger has a depth of 1,271 metres or 4,170 feet, which makes it currently ranked 4th deepest in France and 39th deepest in the world. The cave has grown from an initial surveyed length of 3.5 kilometres in 1956 to the current length of 45 kilometres, about 28 miles. Looking back to 1973, some 50 years ago, with hindsight, the Craven Pothole Club expedition was really quite insignificant compared with the original exploration led by the local French cavers and some subsequent major developments. Even so, the 6 of us had the time of our lives. In summary, I can do no better than quote from Dr. Tony's book, Great Caves of the World. The Gouffre Berger is the perfect cave, the sequence of entrance shafts that drop into a huge river passage, which can be followed into the depths without any horrible narrow bits. No cave of this depth is easy, but the Berger is not too arduous, and it is supremely enjoyable. Thank you for watching.